Are we on? Mic check. Okay, so thank you. I'll have to give a talk that lives up to that introduction now. So I'm Scott, and I'm here today to talk about what I think is a problem that we have in the wider encryption community right now. And I hate talking about problems without solutions, so they are coming. Don't worry about that. I'm not just here to poke holes and poke fun at things. So to set the scene, I'm here to talk about certificates, and we probably all know these by different names. We may know them as server certificates, HTTPS certificates, encryption certificates, whatever you want to call them. But if you want green padlocks and pretty things that Emily talked about this morning on your websites, if you want a green handbag, you need to get a certificate. You need to go to a CA and obtain one of these documents. And we're doing this at volume these days, and we're doing this at a lot of volume. Every day, I scan the top 1 million websites on the planet, and I look at how many of them force you to use HTTPS, how many of them redirect you there when you go on HTTP. And I think this graph kind of speaks for itself. Every 6 months, I publish a report, and the points here are the percentage of those top 1 million that redirect you actively to HTTPS if you try and use them. So every day, literally every day, more and more of us are obtaining more and more certificates. So people ask me, I want to set up HTTPS on my website. Why do I need to go to a CA and pay for one of these things? And historically, you did have to pay. Let's Encrypt are making that free now, but there are still some limitations around the automation requirement. But you have to go and get this thing if you want HTTPS. And the reason that we have to do that is you need to be able to authenticate yourself. The certificate is your proof of identity, and we can't do anything securely unless we can authenticate who we're talking to. You type scotthelm.co.uk into the browser. How do you know that my site sent you the page back? It's the first step of the process, is to verify the authenticity of the party at the other side. And we've known about this problem for a long time. I know everyone here in this room probably knows about the problem and the requirements of authentication. But I would say that most people, most average users know of this problem, but have probably just never thought about it in the right way, because this is the problem that certificates solve, is that on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. You get a certificate and you can prove that you are who you claim to be. That is their purpose, that is their function. So the process of getting one, really simple. You set up your web server, you generate something called a CSR, Certificate Signing Request, and you send that off to your CA of choice. Historically, you had to pay. I use Let's Encrypt, so I don't. You prove that you own the domain, and they send you your certificate back. You deploy that onto your web server, browser comes along, and you send it to the browser, and you get the green padlock, you get the secure connection. Very quickly. Yes. Yeah, so this is a domain-validated certificate, and in that context, then yes, the only challenge there is proof of ownership or control of the domain, actually, not necessarily ownership. But for a DV certificate, which is what we're talking about here, I just do a simple HTTP GET to the origin, and they issue me the cert once I've proved control. And then I just send this certificate to the browser, openly and freely. Every time you come to my website, I just send you my certificate, and it's just a text file. If we look under the hood of a certificate, there's really not that many fancy things in there. They're just key value pairs of information. The common name that it was issued to, who issued the document. We have things like valid from, valid to dates, and there's other pieces of metadata in there. But if you actually look inside a certificate, they're really not that fancy. It's just a text file underneath everything. So the problem is, when you come to my website, I send you my certificate. And that's how I prove who I am. I say, here is my certificate. And of course, that can't be the only part of the process, because if I give you my certificate, why can't you just then give someone else my certificate and say, well, I'm Scott because I gave you the certificate? The requirement is that you hold the key. You have to hold the private key associated with the certificate. This is what allows you to use it. So you have to keep this file, this key, secure. So there's going to be a few questions. Requires audience interaction. Please raise your hands if you have 100% security on your online services. Oh, that's really good, because I was about to say, if you put your hand up, you have to leave. And no one did, right? So no one does. No one has 100% security. Nothing is secure. And we sometimes have people access our environments. Maybe we get court orders. Maybe people leave laptops on buses that contain secret documents. But every now and again, a key falls into the hands of the wrong people. Someone will get my key that is not me. We call this a key compromise. And it can happen for a whole bunch of different reasons. We don't care how or why it happens. Once this key falls into someone else's hand, they can do what we can do, which is to present this certificate to the browser and prove they are now my website. So we now have a scenario where somebody who is not me, not my website, can prove that they are technically. And this is a really bad scenario because it defeats the whole purpose of everything now. We have green HTTPS and a padlock in the browser, maybe not very soon, but it's now meaningless, it's now worthless. So we have to have a way to undo this. And the first thing that you think of is, well, we'll just ask the bad guys to delete the file, right? Like, please don't use our certificate in bad ways. That's had a 0% success rate so far. It's not really helped many people. So we need technical measures. We need revocation. We need to take the trust in that certificate back. We need to stop it from working after we've lost control of it. So there are two mechanisms with which we can do this. I've been compromised, I wake up, my website's been hacked, whatever has happened. I send a revocation request to my CA and say, hey, look, that certificate you issued to me, something bad happened over the weekend, bad guys got my key, I need you to mark it as revoked. And they will do this. They have two mechanisms. First one is a CRL. So this is a certificate revocation list. And as the name implies, it's literally just a big honking list. So they get the list out and they say, Scott's had a bad day, write the entry on, done. And they update the list with this new entry. It's a list of all certificates that have ever been revoked. And there's also an OCSP responder. This is the online certificate status protocol. So instead of downloading this whole big list, with an OCSP responder, you can actually just ask for the status of one certificate. So you say, hey, is this particular certificate revoked? And the OCSP responder will come back with a yes/no answer. It actually says good or revoked. So you say, hey, is this certificate revoked? And the OCSP responder will say, no, it's not revoked. You're good to use it. So we have the mechanisms to fix this problem, right? Except that it's not all kind of rainbows and butterflies. So in this scenario now, you've come to my website and you've been served a certificate. You don't know up front if this has been revoked. You don't know up front if this is an attacker, if someone that's using my certificate. You don't know, so you have to check every time. So you may need to reach out to the CRL. You reach out to the certificate revocation list and you pull it down. Pretty big file these days, but that's fine. We pull down the CRL. The browser will scan through that, and the browser will see that this certificate is on the revocation list and will say, no, I'm not going to accept that because it's on the revocation list. And this is how we prevent this certificate from being used after it's been revoked. It's exactly the same scenario with OCSP, except we send a request to the OCSP responder, and we get the OCSP response back. Now, these in comparison are tiny, because it's literally just a yes/no answer. So we much prefer the smaller size of OCSP. But we have the capabilities. When we come up against a revoked certificate, we have the capabilities of detecting that they've been revoked. So one of the biggest problems with this, first of all, is that you don't know. When you go to the website, you don't know whether it's revoked. You don't know if the person at the other side is good or bad. So you always have to do a revocation check. Now, of course, there's like little bits of cache times in there, but broadly speaking, you always have to check the status of a certificate because we can't make assumptions. So whether or not you're speaking to the genuine me or the attacker impersonating me, the browser always has to reach out and do some kind of rev check. Now, second question, and it's the same rule. If you put your hand up, you have to leave. Who has 100% uptime? No one has 100% uptime. So what about the scenario when the browser reaches out and they're not there? We're starting to look into the first problems of revocation checking now. What should the browser do in this scenario? We've sent our request, maybe for the CRL, maybe to the OCSP responder, and we sit there and we wait, and no answer comes back. Now, historically, in years gone by, we would do what we call a hard fail on this revocation check. So the browser would say, hey, Mr. OCSP responder, this is CRL, give me an answer. Nothing came back. So the browser would say, no, I'm sorry, this infrastructure is gone, it's down, maybe the CA is having a bad day, so I reject this certificate because I can't be sure that it's not revoked. Now, this is the most secure way of doing this. The problem is, this was all legitimate and my website is fine, but my website is now down. The CA goes offline, you go offline. It's a point of failure in the system. But this wasn't the only problem, the availability problem. There are more problems with both of these mechanisms. So let's look at the revocation list first. How big, this one's not a trick question, how big do you think a revocation list might be? Bearing in mind when the browser connects to your site, it has to go download this file and check it. How big would you be comfortable with the browser reaching out and downloading some other file? A couple of bytes, because this is right in front of your TTFB. This is literally one of the first things the browser had to do. Maybe the file's not that big. Maybe it's only 50 kilobytes. Where's the tolerance point? Would you be happy if the browser had to go download a 500K file? What happens when it hits a meg? Because revocation lists only go one way, and that's bigger. There are things we can do to cut them up and shard them, but ultimately revocation lists only go in one direction. And they do just go in one direction. And they can get bigger and bigger and bigger over time. So the scalability of revocation lists was a problem, but it didn't really become too much of a problem because they were largely abandoned. In terms of the client-side checks, the CAs still maintain them, but we don't use revocation lists like this, certainly not in browsers. We use OCSP instead because we love that tiny answer. It's a yes-no answer, so no matter when or how you ask it, you'll always get a tiny OCSP response. So it fixed a lot of the performance overheads, but what question are you asking the OCSP responder? You go to a website, you get the certificate, and you say, 1 second, I need to check the revocation status. So you reach out to the OCSP responder and say, hey, is this certificate revoked? Yes or no? And that question changes depending on which website you visit, because the question you ask is this. I've just opened pornhub.com in my browser, and I would like to know if their certificate is still okay for me to accept. And you've just told the OCSP responder exactly what website you're about to open in the browser. OCSP fixed a huge kind of performance issue with the size of revocation lists, and with it introduced a privacy issue, because you're now essentially advertising your browsing history in basically real time to a third party that the average end user has zero knowledge of. The average end user does not, though these OCSP requests are being sent. So there are many different problems with existing revocation mechanisms. And it was quite a few years ago now in Chromium when the stance changed. And one of the biggest changes that they made was this whole scenario here, this whole online form of revocation checking went from hard fail to soft fail. And this was the first step towards fixing the third-party dependency problem. What happens if the CA goes down? Okay, well, if the CA is down, we'll abandon the check. Because if the CA is offline, we don't want your website to go offline. And what this meant was it was trivially easy for an attacker on the network to simulate the CA being down. Because if the attacker is on the network, they're a network adversary. They control traffic. And they watch the browser make this revocation request. And they just grab that request and toss it in the trash. And to the browser, what does that look like? It looks like the CA is down. It looks like the CA is gone. And the browser would then soft fail through that check. Now, Chromium switched to soft fail a very long time ago. Firefox still does soft fail right now. There's varying timeouts. It's generally like in the 3 to 5 second area. And you don't have to take my word for this. Look at the OCSP endpoint for any certificate. Go into your host file, 127.0.0.1, the endpoint, and hit a site with a revoked cert. I have one, subdomain on my site, revoke.scotthelm.co.uk. Black hole lets encrypt OCSP responder, page will load fine. So when we moved from hard fail to soft fail, this for me was the defining point on when revocation was really broken, because we now have a security mechanism that the people that we're trying to defend against can turn off. And that's essentially why revocation is broken, because the best analogy is it was Adam Langley at Google that said, revocation checking right now as we do it is a seatbelt that snaps in a car crash. You all get in your cars, I bet you all do this, you all get in your cars every day, you drive to it, you put your seatbelts on, and you've never actually used it. You've never depended on it. The mechanism is there, but you've never needed it. And the one time you need it, the one time we're under attack from a network adversary, is the one time it won't work. It's the same as a seatbelt snapping in a crash. That's the only time you actually needed it and it didn't work. So my question would then be, what's the point in putting your seatbelt on? Why do we have seatbelts in cars? And this is where we are with revocation checking. So quite a few years ago now, actually, Chromium completely abandoned revocation checking, and they don't do this anymore. So this is the current view of what we think of when we think of revocation checking. But right now, Chrome browser, and for quite a long time actually, this is what it looks like in Chrome. It doesn't even do it. Chromium browser does not do any kind of online revocation checking, and Firefox is going the same way. Excuse me. So very soon, if Firefox don't back out the change that they committed, I think it was late last year. Is anyone from Firefox here? I've been trying to track this in their code repo. They've already backed out the code to do the online revocation checking, because Firefox soft fails right now, and soft fail rev checking doesn't work. So this is where we are. When I wanted to kind of justify this, because when I say, you know, revocation is broken and it's pointless and there's no use in doing it as it currently stands, I mean that, and this is why. It's not a FUD title, it's not scaremongering. We need to fix this problem. So revocation is broken. I hope that was a good enough explanation for you all to agree with me that we have this issue as more and more of us push towards an encrypted web. These certificates, these keys that we look after become more and more important. And right now, if something goes wrong, which it does, maybe not frequently, but it does go wrong, we need a way to take back the trust in these documents. We can't just keep going on without a mechanism to fix this. So what are we doing to fix this? First thing that I want to talk about is something that Chrome and Firefox actually do themselves. Chrome calls this CRL sets, and Firefox call this one CRL. Now, caveat up front, this will never help me, and it will probably never help any of you. Because what these two mechanisms do is these two browsers independently, they scrape together all the CRLs, hence the names, one CRL. So Firefox grabs all the CRLs out there, and they merge them into this one huge big file. But all they take out of there is high-value certificates, really high-value certificates. So that's things like a certificate authority. Can you imagine Let's Encrypt lose one of their certs? They lose the key. The attacker could then just issue all the certificates in the world they want. We have to have a way to stop that. So CRL sets and one CRL basically covers CA certificates. They are the worst of the worst if they got into the wrong hands. But I'm never going to get my certificate in there. None of you, not even Troy with Have I Been Pwned, is going to get his certificate in there. This is not for us. So we do have that 1% kind of worst of the worst covered, but we still have the other 99% to go. So what can we do there? So yeah, that's how they merge all the CRLs together. So the first thing that I want to talk about is OCSP stapling. A lot of people mention this and bring it up when I talk about revocation. And OCSP stapling it fixes the privacy issue, and I'll explain why it's not a security feature, because it often gets brought up as such, and it really isn't. So OCSP stapling, we talked about the privacy issue with OCSP, and the privacy issue was the browser reaching out to the responder and saying, hey, how does this Pornhub.com certificate look? Is it still good? That was the privacy leak, because it had to fetch back the OCSP response. So OCSP stapling flips that model very slightly, in that instead of the client reaching out to the OCSP responder, the server reaches out to the OCSP responder and fetches the OCSP response. And I mentioned earlier there was just like a little bit of a caching window, so you can actually fetch this response, and people generally cache them for around a day. Now, it sounds kind of weird at first glance, because this now looks like the server is certifying itself as not revoked, but it's fine, because just in the same way our certificate is signed by the CA and the browser can make sure it's genuine and hasn't been tampered with, etc., the OCSP response is signed in exactly the same fashion. So the browser has the same level of assurance about the OCSP response as it does about the certificate, no matter where it got it from. So this is fine. The server will grab that, it will cache it, and we call it stapling because the idea is you take your certificate, the OCSP response, you staple the two documents together and hand them both to the browser at the same time. So now the browser doesn't have to do this privacy and performance impacting check out to the responder. Now, the reason that this is only a performance and privacy feature is how many network attackers do you think are going to enable OCSP stapling? And the answer is none. Why would they, right? This is an optional performance and privacy feature that we can't depend on an attacker to have enabled, because they just wouldn't. This is not how this works. So how do we take that and make it mandatory? And we're currently working on this. This is something that Let's Encrypt actually support in terms of the certificates right now. We call it OCSP must staple. So it takes the optional nature of stapling and it makes it mandatory. So when we go to Let's Encrypt to get our CSR and send it to them to get our certificate back now, what we say instead is, I would like a certificate with the must staple flag set. And this is literally just a little flag inside the certificate that says, this certificate must be served with a valid OCSP staple alongside it. It makes that OCSP stapling non-optional, which right now it is. So when you serve that certificate out to the client, it now looks like this. We have an extension at the bottom, and it literally just says OCSP must staple. And it changes the scenario fundamentally, because the attacker now has two choices. Me as the genuine host using a non-revoked certificate, I can OCSP staple. This is fine, this is easy. Pretty much all platforms support this. It's actually enabled by default on IIS. It's an optional config option on Nginx and Apache. But this is easy for me to do, right? I'm the genuine host, I get the OCSP response, I can cache that and maybe renew it once a day. It's valid for actually 7 days right now. And this is easy, okay? But we switch me out with the attacker, someone that wants to impersonate me, someone that wants to use my certificate, they now have two choices. They can either serve the certificate without the staple or serve it with. So if they serve it without the staple, the browser's going to look at that and say, well, it's a must staple certificate and it doesn't have a staple, so I reject that straight away. The second option is to serve it with the staple. So the attacker goes to the OCSP responder and they get the OCSP response, except now the OCSP response says, well, this certificate's revoked. They staple that to the certificate, give that to the browser, and the browser says, well, this response says it's revoked, so I refuse to accept this certificate. And with just that one little flag in the certificate, we can take OCSP stapling from optional to mandatory, and that would fully fix the revocation problem. But as with most new things, it's not quite that simple. Right now, only Firefox supports OCSP must staple, and I know there's been I've had lots of conversations with people at Chrome about supporting this, and the concern is that servers are not quite there in terms of their stapling implementation. IIS does this by default and is quite good at it. Nginx and Apache, if you enable it, are also fairly good. But there's a couple of edge cases where, what was the one I have with Apache? If Apache gets a malformed OCSP response, it doesn't actually validate it and it will staple it. So there's like a weird bug there. And what they're saying is we just need to wait for a little bit more maturity before we'd be happy enabling this. So for me, in the shortest term, this is probably one of the best options that I would like to see. I already have my staple certificates. I'm confident in my ability to staple, so I use this. But maybe not everyone else is, and we do have a few more options. And one of the biggest options right now is to increase our transparency in the ecosystem, because not only is there the scenario where an attacker can steal my key to use my certificate, what if they just manage to get one? They trick Let's Encrypt. And let's say Troy comes along, he puts his black hoodie on, he goes to Let's Encrypt and he says, hi, I'm Scott. And Let's Encrypt are like, hey, great, Scott, here's a certificate for scotthelm.co.uk. We call that misissuance. He's got a certificate that he should not have, but it's still the same problem. I now need to revoke that and stop him from using it. So that's the same revocation problem, but how do we actually get out ahead of that? How would I know? Think about this scenario. How do I know when Troy gets that certificate? Is Troy going to come tell me? Probably not. So we need to have more transparency in the ecosystem to make sure that people can't get these certificates without us knowing. So we're introducing something right now, and this is literally coming in a matter of weeks into Chrome called certificate transparency. And this adds one extra requirement onto the certificate authority. So this is what the scenario looked like earlier. All the CA had to maintain was a CRL, OCSP, and their other bits of infrastructure, but CT adds one new mechanism on top of this, and it's called a CT log, a certificate transparency log. And this is, for those of you if you get excited about blockchain, this is essentially a Merkle hash tree. This is the blockchain. And the CA, when they issue a certificate, will be required to write an entry onto this log and say, hey, I've just issued a new certificate for scotthelm.co.uk. Here are all the details. And what I can do as a site operator is just watch these logs. So we can see what all CAs are issuing in real time around the world. And it's not just the CAs that can write these entries onto the log. The Google crawler, right now, as it's crawling the web, if it finds certificates, will automatically submit them to these logs. So yes, Let's Encrypt will submit them and get what we call the signed certificate timestamp back. That's proof it's been submitted. But you could do this yourself. If your CA is not logging right now, you can still log your own certificates. You as a person can go to a website right now, grab their cert, and submit it to a CT log and get a proof back. So this is an open system. As long as it's a valid cert from a CA, you can grab that thing, go submit it to a CT log, and have like a record that it's been done, and you will get your proof back. So this is great, but how do we know the CA does it? If I say, hey, Let's Encrypt, you must log all of your certificates, how do I know if they don't? What if they only log 99% of them and don't tell me about the other 1%? We need to know that certificates are definitely logged to have full and assured transparency. And this is the proof, this is the SCT, and this is how we use it. So we take the SCT and we put it inside the certificate. So when I went to Let's Encrypt and asked for my certificate, the current Chromium CT qualification criteria, as we call it, actually requires this certificate to be logged to 3 independent logs. One operated by Google, one not operated by Google, and all 3 of them independent from the other. So we've got forced diversity, and we also have some resilience in the ecosystem as well. So when you submit that, they actually submit the pre-certificate, which is the certificate right before it was signed. You submit the pre-certificate into the logs, and you get those 3 SCTs back. Those are your 3 proofs that you've definitely submitted this thing into the log. And Let's Encrypt will then just sign that into the certificate. They put them inside the certificate, sign the document, give it back to me. I install that onto my website, goes out to the browser. Chromium will parse those SCTs out and check the signatures on all the SCTs to make sure they're valid. So is it this month or next month? Do you know, Emily? It's literally imminent. I haven't quite kept up on the release cycle, but literally within a number of weeks, Chromium will start requiring this. So if it gets a certificate that was issued that does not have CT qualification, i.e. it does not have enough SCTs, Chrome will just say, no. This certificate could have been issued in secret. There's no proof that this certificate is public knowledge. We want to see those SCTs inside the document, and we are literally right on the verge of this being launched into Chromium. And I'm really excited about this because it's forcing transparency in the ecosystem, and what that means is it's harder to do bad things. Whether that's intentionally malicious or just negligent, it doesn't matter, but it becomes more difficult to do bad things. We can audit CAs, and we're no longer in this situation where I can get a certificate for your website and you cannot know about it. Like if I get a certificate for haveibeenpwned.com, I'm pretty sure Troy wants to know. If I get a certificate for onepassword.com, I'm sure all the guys over here would want to know. I'm a bad guy running around on the internet with a valid cert for their domain. I could do a lot of damage with that. And right now they're blind. CT will change that. CT is going to be very big things in this ecosystem. But it's not just CT that we're looking at either. When you go to a CA, the bad guy goes to a CA, bad girl goes to a CA and says, hey, I'm onepassword.com, I want a certificate. The proof is on them to verify my identity, my control of the domain before they issue. But we don't have any way to say, hey, I only want certificates from DigiCert. This is the only CA I want to use. This is my domain. I get to say who issues certs for it. And just a few months ago, we finally got the mechanism to do that. We got something called Certificate Authority Authorization. And it fixes this problem where I only want this one CA to issue for my domain. How many CAs are in the world? Does anyone know? Out of interest? There's hundreds of these things. Go and have a look in your root store. There's probably a couple of hundred roots in there. Then we have resellers and cross signs off the top of those. There are hundreds of these things out there. So if someone wants to get a certificate for my domain, they don't have to go to my CA because there's no concept of my CA. They can go to any one of the CAs in the world and try and trick them. So they say, okay, we'll try and trick these guys into issuing. Okay, they didn't work. We'll go and try and trick these guys. No, they didn't work. We'll try and trick these guys. They can just keep going all over the place to see if they can get someone to issue a certificate that shouldn't have. And CAA changes this. It allows me to specify what my preferences are in terms of who can issue. And the one thing that I love about CAA is that this is probably the best bang for buck in terms of a security mechanism because it's just a DNS record. This is as simple as it can get for deploying a pretty strong security mechanism. There was a new resource record type. Can you see my laser pointer? Yeah. There was a new resource record type called CAA created specifically for this. So just like we have A records, text records, we now have CAA records. And what you do is you set the issue directive and put the name of the CA, their domain, that you authorize to issue. So when I issue this on my website, what I am saying is I only authorize Let's Encrypt to issue certificates for my domain. So now you're the bad guy, you go online and you go to terribleca.com with poor security and say, hey, I want a certificate for scotthelm.co.uk because that's me. Those CAs from September were required, first of all, to check this record. They now have to do this. They are mandated by our governing body, the CAB forum, the CA browser forum. They have to check this record. So, crazyterribleca.com is going to go, oh, well, I'm not even allowed to do this. So before I start any process with you, I'm just not going to because I'm not allowed to according to this DNS record. And of course, there's organizations that may have more than one CA. That's fine. Just create multiple records. And this is how easy it is. On top of the issue ones, you can even specify whether a CA is allowed to issue wildcard certificates or not. So you can give them permission to issue standard certs and not wildcard because they're a lot more powerful. There's also a reporting mechanism. We have something called the IODEF record, and you can actually ask the CA to email you and tell you if someone tried to get a certificate and they refused because of the authorization record. So you can know if someone's trying to get certificates for your domain. And coupling these things together, this becomes really powerful really quickly. CT and CAA combined, we're already starting to address really large parts of the problem. And the process, dead simple again, I send the CSR to Let's Encrypt. During that issuance process, right there, Let's Encrypt has to reach out into DNS and check that record. They fetch DNS back, and they're either going to see, if I have no records set, by the way, that's completely fallback capable. No records means full issuance for everybody. So if there's no records, it's just like the Wild West, like it is right now. If there is a record set, they have to obey what the record says. Hopefully, as I do, the record is set. They will then continue issuance, and I can keep using my certificate as normal. Now, you can see there's loads of hands popping up all over the place at the back there. So I just want to leave you this one question, because I do have a very good Q&A section for this, because this normally provokes lots of questions and sometimes angry responses. So I just want to leave you this one question before I open the floor up. And the question is, right now, if you needed to, if I called you and said, hey, someone stole your certificate, or I got one from a CA, or I bribed a CA to issue me one, right now, could you revoke it? And that is, for me, a pretty important question that I want to leave you with. So thank you very much. So I intentionally leave like a good 5 or so minutes of Q&A. So literally, it's like, okay, I'm just going to start talking and say, Dev, go ahead.
Mechanical question about that last part. If you ask for a search for
Uh-huh.
will it check the CA record for the component domain or the subdomain?
Will it check the
CAA record, will it check it for the ETLD+1?
Okay, so great question. So the question from Dev there was, if you go to revoke.scotthelm.co.uk, will it check the CAA record?
No, not if I go there. What will the C, I asked to send a CSR for a subdomain. Will the certain
Oh, so the CA at the point of issuance.
Yeah.
Gotcha, right. So if I set the, tell you what, I'll just jump back. If I set these records like I showed here at my Apex, and I request for a certificate for revoke. The first thing the CA will do is check for a CAA record at revoke. If it finds one or any, it will obey them. If it doesn't, it will then walk up towards the parent until it hits a record. So if it gets all the way to the Apex, say I got like test.revoke.scotthelm, it would find nothing at test, nothing at revoked, and then it would hit these at my Apex and apply that. So it walks its way back up until it either hits a record or they're all non-set. That answer the question? So what was, let me just clarify. Do you mean, did you say transparency there? So certificate transparency is a requirement of publicly trusted CAs. So as of, in a few weeks, whenever it is, I can't remember the exact date, but if the browser receives a certificate that is not provably in a CT log, it will be rejected. So it doesn't matter what CA issued it, where it came from, how it was made. The browser will want the SCTs. And I actually showed how, in the slides here, how they're embedded into the certificates. There are actually 2 different ways that hosts can deliver. There's a TLS extension, which is very similar to OCSP stapling, and they can actually also be delivered with the OCSP response. So as a host, if your CA gave you a certificate that was not logged in the appropriate number of CT logs, you could log it yourself, fetch the SCTs, and deliver them. So I mean, the good thing with certificate transparency is, like, when I talk about it, most people, A, don't know about it, and B, don't realize that it only came into existence in, like, 2014. And it's gone from nothing to globally deployed in 4 years. And the reason is because the CA can do it with no cooperation from the site owner, the site maintainer. And that's the only reason, is there's zero knowledge or input required from the mass community. So based on the numbers, someone will break this. Someone will boo-boo and will not be ready for the Chromium release. I guarantee that, just because there's so many CAs, someone has to get this wrong. But you as a site operator could take that into your own hands and make sure you were CT qualified, even if your CA was terrible. I'm not sure if that answered the question. I'll come back to you. Yes. So is that more like, what's the purpose of the CT log? So the purpose of the logs is we need transparency in the ecosystem for a few things. Number one, that's my domain, and if someone issues a certificate for it, I should be able to know because that's part of my security posture, my monitoring. The second thing is it discourages, like some people say that CT doesn't do anything, but it discourages bad actors because you now can't bribe a CA, you can't get a cert, you can't do things in secret behind closed doors. So with this level of transparency, we can monitor and audit CAs, make sure they're doing things correctly. They can't issue certs that we don't know about, which CT's actually already brought to light many scenarios. CT was one of the things that helped us see some of the problems inside Symantec.
Yeah, what I'm saying, like I would like to know example of vendor certificates. For example, Google banned semantic certificates.
Yep.
Other browsers did it. So it would be useful for me to know that. So isn't there any place to log this kind of thing?
No, so CT logs in that regard they're just completely open append-only logs. Like that's their criteria. There's no, does Chrome trust this, does Firefox not? If it's a certificate from a CA, it goes in the log and it's auditable. And as far as anything else is concerned, CT doesn't care. It's just an append-only immutable log. The only criteria is that the certificate came from a CA. Like that's it. After that, we don't care about anything with CT.
So I'm like you. I think it's super huge that Chrome is going ahead and making this improvement here. Do you have any other sort of insights or on Firefox and if anybody else is doing this? I'm sorry if I missed that.
No, that's fine. So yeah, so the Chromium will be the first browser to require some form of CT qualification. They have, I can't remember the domain, but I'll happily tweet it afterwards. They have their CT qualification criteria outlined on the project site. Firefox will be next. Last time I checked, they hadn't quite decided exactly what CT qualification would mean in Firefox. But the good thing about this is it's like many security mechanisms. Chrome's going to be first to do this, just because, they're first to do this, whatever. But because Chrome will require all certificates to be publicly logged, all certificates will be publicly logged, right? It doesn't matter if Firefox is a little bit late and Internet Explorer will do it in 2049. The main thing is, I only say that because someone from Microsoft's here. Chromium forcing CT logging is good enough to get us, pretty much all the way there, to be honest, because if you don't CT log the cert, it won't work in Chrome. So the requirement basically is that all certs have to be logged now. It will be great when the other vendors do it, don't get me wrong. And as I say, I know Firefox is coming, and I'm sure the other browser vendors will hopefully get there. But it's kind of like the Symantec distrust that was just mentioned. Chromium and Firefox have done it, and that's enough. We don't necessarily need 100% community effort. Sure, go ahead, Jeff. Oh, nice. So is that a requirement of ATS? Oh, nice. So I'm not very familiar with the iOS stuff, but I will check that out. That sounds really cool. Yes?
Yeah, does OCSP scheduling work well with non-TLS things in mobile 659
So I've not experimented enough to have a definitive answer there. All of my tests, my experiments are all based around. Oh, sorry. Yeah, my bad. So the question there was OCSP stapling outside of the concept of a TLS connection or something like SMIME, you said. My own tests are not enough to answer that question with a good enough answer. I know that, to be honest, for me, even Nginx and Apache, the things that I mentioned there, I think they're good enough. And the thing that we have to remember is, if you get a must staple cert, it's because you asked for one. If you asked for one and then you staple terribly, I think that's your fault. And you should have not asked for one. But we should all have the option to enable this. But as long as you know the status of the cert and that the cert wasn't revoked during its lifetime, because the cert could have also passed outside of its lifetime by then, if you're talking about that far into the future. I don't know, that'd be an interesting one actually, because in the concept of TLS, we don't, once the cert's gone past its expiry date, we don't care about it actually. So I've never thought about that kind of check outside of the lifetime. I'll have a look at that one and come back. Jim is waving at me. Oh, was that time out?
Talk about browser support.
Yeah.
I'm concerned about other clients, like when I'm doing server-to-server communication, non-traditional clients. How is language support when I want to use my language as a client for stateless?
So I focus a lot on browser support generally because they drive the adoption and creation of these mechanisms. Like CT's largely come about because of efforts from Chrome. You know, in server to server, I mean, as long as your library supports that, it's your choice to enforce it. Like if you use Chrome, they're forcing CT qualification on certs, right? So I mean, this can be done in non-browser environments. I've talked about mutual authentication in TLS before now and thought about how useful CT would be in that scenario, but it's totally up to you to implement that. But so the concepts apply. Like you can take the concept of CT and move it into a different client-server scenario. It might even be server-server scenario. And the concepts still apply and have value, but it falls to you then. Yes?
So I think I was pretty excited to hear about the certificate transparency and making that, channel that out some languages, making it better. I'm curious though, how would me as a domain owner actually get that? Is that something where this is published and I would rep it?
Yeah.
What's the actual usage of that?
So the question there was, it's great that CA is logged to CT, but how do I know as a domain owner? Would that be a fair? So there's a couple of really good things that I use. The first one is a website called Search, which is crt.sh. That's like a log monitoring tool where you can go punch in your domain and just see all of the certs. There is an RSS feed on that, but it's still kind of like a manual process. sslmate.com is then the next thing I recommend, which has, for a limited number of domains for free, they will monitor the logs and email you every time they see a new cert and say, hey, we've just found this new one. But weirdly, and this might be like super controversial right now, I'm currently recommending Facebook. Facebook have a CT log monitoring tool, and I literally get push notifications to my phone when a CA issues a cert for me, because Facebook monitors all the CT logs. I say, hey, this is my domain, and I literally get push notifications in the app. So it's like, hey, someone liked cute cat picture. Oh, and someone issued a cert for scotthelm.co.uk. And I just love that convenience. I love push notifications. If you don't have an account, they can also email you. But I find that that's the best recommendation I make right now. So yes, there are services that will monitor it on your behalf and notify you in pretty much near real time. Like there can be small delays. Technically, a CA can submit to the log, and depending on how fast the log operator is, they have either a 24 or 48-hour period to get it on the log. We call that the MMD, the maximum merge delay. So technically, you could find out up to 48 hours after issuance that it had been issued. Am I pushing time? Okay, yeah. I'll hang around with the coffees. It's the break now, right? Come and find me in the break. Thank you very much, everyone.